And now it's time for Mob Talk Radio with your host, Jeff Canarsie.
Yo, Lord Willin, Jeff Canarsie, Mob Talk Radio. Check it out. Yo, we stay quiet like Russell Buffalino when things will get ugly like Pepsi's death in Casino. Who do we know? No one, nobody. But we're all well respected like Della Croce and Gotti. I know wild nights, Havana Nocturne. Light up a cigar and watch your spot burn. You'll get patty whacked, I'm tough like Irish dock workers. Run with guys, hooligans and block lurkers. Corner berserkers, street savvy soldiers. You owe, you better pay. Don't make me say I told you. Code you don't betray, I say what I mean. Providence and Brooklyn all the way to the Bean. I'd rather be unseen, like Vinny the Chin. I don't gotta go to Vegas to see cities of sin. Pull the pin, drop bombs like Danny Green. I write homicide like the murder machine. Lansky Luciano, mastermind the racket. Up in the clam house with $1 million in my jacket. Move around when the streets get darker. Pay homage to real bosses like Gambino and Patriarca. Mob talking, but you don't talk to the mob. Lord Will and Jeff Canarsie, we stay on our job. This is Mob Talk, straight from the streets. Mob Talk, the life over beats. Lord Will and Jeff Canarsie, bringing you the real. Kill all rats, you already know the deal. This is Mob Talk, straight from the streets. Mob Talk, the life over beats. Lord Will and Jeff Canarsie, bringing you the real. Kill all rats, you already know the deal.
And welcome to Mob Talk Radio. I am your host, Jeff Canarsie. Today we are going to cover your questions. We're going to talk about Frank Sinatra and his mob ties, which is a very interesting story. A lot of people don't get that completely right, and it's kind of all over the place because he knew a lot of people. But before we get there, just a little bit of news. Bonanno family capo Ronnie Gialonzo was sentenced the other day in court. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison. 48-year-old New York Mafia captain ran an illegal gambling and extortion racket from 98 to about 2017. He ended up pleading guilty to racketeering conspiracy back in March. And federal sentencing guidelines pretty much recommended that the sentence fall right under about 7 years, but the judge wasn't going to have any part of it. He ends up getting hit with 12 years for extortion and 2 more additional years tacked on for violating his supervised release. He's been to jail before, been to prison before. That's nothing new. He was also forced to forfeit $1.25 million, and he's been forced to sell his mansion in Howard Beach because it was built by ill-gotten gains, which means anytime you use illegal profits to build a house, government can seize that. Thank you, RICO laws. He also has to pay restitution for 5 loan sharking victims in the amount of $268,000. This was according to the New York Post. And pretty much with that, that's pretty much the way that goes. He is the nephew of Vinny Asaro, who we all know had been tied to the Lufthansa heist, but was found acquitted of those charges and then was put back in prison for his part in the car torching thing that happened about a couple of years ago. It actually happened, but he's just now paying for sort of that. Also in the news, Joey Lombardo, who was at one time the mob boss of Chicago, apparently once out of prison. He's been locked up for more than a decade after being convicted in the infamous Family Secrets trial. He's serving a life sentence for his role in at least 10 mob murders, which are all allegations. Lombardo truly is one of the last remaining guys from a different era of Chicago, especially a more prosperous era. He pretty much refused to admit that he was a made guy. He claimed that he was innocent and is actually still fighting to be released from prison. He's 89 years old, and he wrote a detailed letter to the judge asking for help to get a new lawyer to fight his release, and detailed some of his hardships during his time behind bars. The odds are he's not going to get out, but he's at least attempting in vain in some points to try to get out of the mob. So that's sort of what we've got on the news. There's something else I'm going to talk about. I don't know if I covered this last week. It's getting a little bit of press, which is sort of infuriating me a little bit, and that's on the latest edition of Mob Talk Shitdown. They're making a huge issue out of this Dominic Grande thing. If you've been around, you've been listening, Dom Grande's house was vandalized, and George Anastasia and Dave Ratweiser are trying to make this a Mafia hit. They're trying to make this an incredibly bigger offer than it actually, or they're trying to make this an incredibly bigger deal than it really is. And it's just shows how much Dave Schratweiser and George Anastasia are actually looking for fucking press clippings. In one of their latest bullshit videos, they pretty much point out everybody who's allegedly a member of the Philadelphia Mafia, which I think is fucking repulsive, disgusting. And they're making it, what they're trying to do is tie Dominic Grande into New Jersey indictments, which from what I understand, he will be indicted. And so they're using that sort of as the preface for why Dominic Grande's house was vandalized. Now, from what I've been able to find out from some people that I do know, is that this was not a mob-related issue. This was a Big Mouth-related issue. I'm sure if somebody hears this and they think that what I'm saying is inaccurate, I'm sure my phone will ring. However, what I seem to have gotten from multiple people, this isn't a one-source deal. This is a multiple people deal. And for the most part, the story pretty much lines up the exact same way. And this is what I heard. This is not a you're getting indicted in the Jersey shit, shut your mouth or we'll kill you kind of deal. This is just what the press, your idiots like George Anastasia and Dave Ratweiser want to tell you. This is what they want to do to kind of make it more salacious than it really is. From what I understand, there was something that took place on the Jersey Shore that Grande opened his mouth about somebody and it got back to Philadelphia, and that was the reaction. That's what I'm told it was. I was told that it was more of an issue of somebody with a big mouth talking shit about somebody else. And, things get back to Philly. And if you've ever been to Philly, you know Philadelphia guys. They're not ones to take a back step to anybody. They're not going to take any shit from anybody. And that's how they chose to react. We can argue all day long the validity of why they had to go that direction with it. But that's what I heard. I heard this is more of a shit-talking sort of thing, has nothing to do with any sort of crime. This is shut your fucking mouth, stop running it about other fucking people. That's what I was told it was. I happen to believe that, and I believe that because it came from at least 4 different people. I'm not going to get into who they are, but the 4 people would know. They would definitely know what's going on. And I don't make one thing that people need to understand. I don't make phone calls to people about this stuff. In the past, I've made a couple of phone calls asking a couple of things, but these are people that somehow, I guess my phone number gets sort of transferred from guy to guy. I don't know how this happens, but my phone rings and it's somebody who identifies himself and they say, hey, this is what's really going on. Make sure that, if you're going to cover this, you cover it truthfully because, your Dave Ratweisers and your George Shithead Anastasias are going to get it all wrong, which they do repeatedly. And this is the reality of it, is that I then went on to the Mob Talk Shitdown YouTube page, and I detailed, just like I am now, exactly what happened. And within, I would say, probably 20 minutes of me putting this up, they removed it because they don't want the truth out. They don't want anybody to counterclaim their hallucinations, because that's what this is, hallucinations. They're not telling the truth. They're guessing. They're making it out to be like a fucking Marty Scorsese screenplay, and that's just not the truth. Just like, to take a good example of this is, I had words with that piece of shit Ratweiser outside of Joey Merlino's trial. Because A, he's a jerk off, B, he's a fucking liar, C, he's got an ego like you wouldn't fucking believe, and he was sitting there when Joey was signing the paperwork to accept the plea deal in federal court. He knew exactly what the fuck happened. He was sitting there. And what does he do? He waits till Joey comes out and he bum rushes him. Oh, let's talk about the fucking plea. Joey doesn't want to talk about the fucking plea. You were just sitting in there, you jerk off. You know exactly what fucking happened. So it's just trying to bum rush Joey, trying to get a wave clip, a sound file to boost his fucking ego. I don't care if the guy's an Academy Award winning dickhead or whatever the fuck it is he is. The guy's a scumbag. He's a bottom feeder. They don't report necessarily facts. Sometimes they do get stuff right. I will give them that. But for the most part, all this Dominic Grande shit you're hearing is all for nothing. It's just a design for them to play off an idea that this is somehow like a Godfather film. And it's stupid. It's fucking repulsive. And this shit where they sit out and they film all these fucking guys going in and out of a house, in and out of a fucking supermarket, in and out of wherever the fuck it is that they go. They're making allegations against people, making assertions against people who may not have anything to do with anything. And so I think that there's a due diligence on the part of Dave Ratweiser to not say shit like that. There's also a due diligence for guys like George Anastasia to not point fingers at guys. Look, if they haven't been convicted of something, why are you putting words in their mouth? Why are you putting ideas about who they are? You don't know them. You get all your information from fucking scumbags and jerk-offs, and you run with it. And that's fine. That's your job. That's what you do. I get it. But I think that there comes a fucking responsibility with what you do. Maybe I'm different than everybody else. I've been told I am. Maybe that's why people talk to me. I take what I do. I don't run with, well, this guy has a checkered past, so I'm going to fucking say that he has a checkered past, and I'm going to like tongue-in-cheek it, making him out to be something he is. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to defend people that I know, and I know a lot of fucking people, and until they're convicted in a court of fucking law, whatever they're accused of doesn't fucking exist to me. This used to be a country where you get accused of something, you're presumed innocent until you're proven fucking guilty, and it is what it is. Now it's like guilty until proven innocent. What, are we living in London? Because that's how it operates there. So, I get a little tired of it because I think that they have a responsibility not to be nice. If they don't want to be nice, that's fine. They're journalists. I'm not a fucking journalist, no matter how many times Elio Forcina, my attorney, and my friend says, oh, you're a journalist. I'm not a fucking journalist. I could give a fuck less about that. All I simply am is a mouthpiece for my friends. And that's what I'm always going to be. That's why I know guys in Chicago. I know guys in Philly. I know guys in Jersey. I know guys in New York. I know guys in fucking Rhode Island, Connecticut. You name it, I know them. Italy. I know guys in Italy. So I defend guys who have not been convicted of fucking anything. It's not my job to try to steer you in the wrong direction and lie, because I don't lie about any of these guys. I tell you the truth. If it's bold-faced, I'm going to say it. But I think that my perspective is different than journalists because I don't believe everything the police tell me. I certainly don't sit down with fucking cops and have coffee, and I don't sit down with federal prosecutors and beg to get case files either. That's not my thing. I don't do that. They're the fucking enemy as far as I'm concerned. They always will be the enemy. They always have been the enemy. And I don't ever see myself ever be in a position where anybody in the FBI I'm on first name basis with, and I don't see a situation where I'm ever friendly to those fucking greaseballs. Because that's what they are. They're fucking degenerates. My grandfather told me at a very young age, listen, cops have a job to do. They just got to do what they got to do. But they lie, they manipulate, they steal, just like every other human being. There is no single human being in this fucking world that doesn't lie about something. We stretch the truth sometimes when we have to deflect. You don't tell the cops the fucking truth. You never do. Their job is to find out you're lying. Why are you going to give it to them? So the point I'm trying to make is, and that probably makes me a degenerate on some fucking level with these journalists, but I don't care. It's how I grew up. It's what I know. This is what you do. So I can't cater to this fucking idea that I'm going to have a cup of coffee with some jerk off that's got the 3 yellow letters on his fucking shirt to get a case file. And that's the other thing. Most of these cases are on Pacer. You can go on Pacer. It's illegal, documented. All the legal paperwork that goes into trials goes to the judge and gets posted online. You can fucking join Pacer. You can download the shit and read it for yourself. You know, that's the like hidden secret that these people don't seem to fucking understand. Is that everything is available. Information is available. It's not like George Anastasia is having some cloak and dagger fucking meeting with some jerk off with brown shoes wearing a fucking badge in a fucking diner. He goes on Pacer like the rest of us. And he's not getting information that is any more fucking credible than mine or anybody else's. It's the same information, but the difference between me and him is I get it right. I get it right. He doesn't. It's not ego. It's not bravado. I could give a fuck less. It's just that I know who to talk to. And I know when somebody's telling me the truth and when somebody's not. If I know somebody's not telling me everything, then I don't fucking report it. Unless I'm 100% fucking positive. You will never hear me fucking report something. Never. But these guys, they run off at the mouth and they report whatever they can report. Because remember, they're fucking mob experts. There's no such thing as a fucking mob expert. No such fucking thing. Now, some of you say, well, you've said that. I never said that about my fucking self. Ever. That moniker was put on me. I never fucking said that myself. To be an expert, you know everything. What, you're sitting at the fucking dinner table, guys, cutting up fucking proceeds from fucking extortion or racketeering? No, you weren't. Were you there when this guy got clipped and that guy got clipped and you know when the order was given and by who? No, you don't know. So you're not a fucking expert. You educate, you have to sort of make an educated guess sometimes. And these guys don't know the streets. They didn't grow up on the streets. They didn't grow up around the life. They're journalists, so they have a narrative, right? But when you grow up on the streets, you grow up around the life. You know the politics of it all, and so that enables me, especially, to sort of bob and weave through a lot of the bullshit that does come out. That's the only difference. Believe me, if I sat here and I lied every week, you know the fucking headaches I would get from people. But I don't get headaches. So, all that being said, that's pretty much what we got going on the news. We got a big show today. We're going to do some questions, and then we're going to get to Frank Sinatra, which a lot of people have commented and you know, added sort of their own type of you know, facts that they know about Sinatra. But the one interesting thing is that how Sinatra really had ties to begin with, and it started at an early age through his father, believe it or not. His father, really, Marty, worked for mob guys. He was a legit guy, was actually a firefighter, but he drove the bootleg truck a couple times, would buy bootleg, you know, liquor from them and then sell it. So that's sort of where Sinatra met a lot of these guys. But, you know, it goes from that to like Skinny D'Amato to obviously he ends up with Joe Kennedy for a while, JFK, all that crap. And, you know, the Fischetti Brothers, and it just goes on and on and on. While it's not a... most of the things that I will talk about are pretty much well known. But before we get to that, I wanted to get to these questions. And once again, if I didn't get to your question, there's probably a reason for it. Either it's a time constraint, or it's been asked before and I just don't want to answer it again, or there may be sensitive, you know, sort of sensitive information that I really can't get into. I always try to protect people that I know. That's not to make an assertion or an accusation about them that's unfounded. It's just that I know that if I was in that situation, I wouldn't want a friend of mine saying that about me, and that's exactly why I don't. And that's just the way it's going to be. And that's why I think people listen to what I do, because I don't bullshit. People try all the time to sort of go behind my back and see if what I'm telling them is true. And they come back and they find out it is, and they're like, wow. So there you go. I was going to talk about Ed Scarpo, but I decided not to. He's a jerk off. First of all, let me just say this. I don't live in Virginia. I live in New York City. I had a massive lawsuit in the Eastern District of New York, which you can't have if you don't live in New York. I got a New York telephone number. Ask around. They'll all tell you. So I don't know what garbage he's trying to spew, but my attorney did reach out to him because he was saying some pretty nasty shit that was like not even fucking accurate, just bull-faced lies. And what I think is hilarious is it was designed to sort of rattle him, and it did, because he apologized profusely to my lawyer. Oh, I'll take it all down, which he did. Out of fear. And listen, I don't want the moniker or anybody to think for 1 second that I employ a lawyer for any time anybody says anything. First of all, my attorney is my friend. We're very close friends, like brothers, and if he sees that I'm getting affected by somebody lying about me because I have a nasty temper, he does what he does. You know, he does me a solid. He says, let me handle it for you. This way you don't need the headache. And he was very polite and just said, hey, listen, Ed, you know you're lying. You know he doesn't live in Virginia. You know he doesn't have a Virginia number. You know he lives in fucking Brooklyn or wherever the fuck he is in New York City. Stop lying. Stop trying to discredit people because you're a fucking jerk off. And he immediately, oh, I'm sorry, I'll take it down. He does, and then he starts his shit again by pulling up some weird bullshit fucking email that I wrote like 4 years ago and all this other shit. So I'm really not going to waste my time with it other than to say, look, he tried to shake Angel Gotti down. It didn't work, and he got caught doing that. He got caught plagiarizing Jerry Capisci. He denied that. He said I made up the fucking post on his timeline, which I don't know how that's fucking possible. It's a screenshot from his fucking timeline. Am I that fucking good? Do I know that many fucking heavyweights that I could fucking hack into a Facebook page and fake a timeline post? Get the fuck out of here. These people, listen, journalists aside, we all do what we all do. We don't all get along. That's just the reality of it. It seems like I hate everybody. I really don't. I have a respect for certain people. But the minute you attack my friends, we got a problem. And I call people out on it. I'm not one to sit back. I don't take a backward step for anybody. And so I proved him wrong. And he's got an issue with it because it makes him look like the dunce that he is. And so now he's crying over spilled milk. But one thing I can definitely say is I've never plagiarized anybody's work, never borrowed anybody's work, and I have never under any fucking circumstances tried to shake anybody down over an article saying that unless they gave me an interview, if you give me an interview, I'll take down all the negative shit I said about you and I won't do it ever again. You're not a journalist at that point. You're a scumbag. You're a bottom-feeding jerk-off, loser, nothing. He even fucking said that he called this 804 number looking for me to have coffee to settle the dispute like men. First of all, there ain't going to be no fucking settling no dispute. If I see you, I'm going to smack the fuck out of you. That's just the reality of it. That's what will happen. And you're calling an 804 number? I don't have an 804 number. I have a 917 number. 917 is the area code to New York, you fucking degenerate. Talk to your rat friends. Half of them know my number. They prank me or whatever. They know my number because it gets handed around. So the idea that he somehow doesn't know this is bullshit. He's just trying to act like a fucking tough guy. I wouldn't sit down with him. I would rather sit down with fucking 3 Asian hookers who are fucking high on angel dust and try to have a meaningful fucking conversation. Can't have it with a guy that's a liar. You cannot have a meaningful conversation that takes my friends and makes them look like fucking psychopaths. Lies. Doesn't even tell the truth. And then he regurgitates every article that's written, changes, puts a couple things in his narrative, and then slams his fucking name on it like he's somebody. So don't give me that. That's just where I stand with that. I'm not going to say another word about it. It's just the point that I'm not a rat. I'm not a snitch. I don't tell on people. I mind my business, and I'm going to defend my friends. Unlike this prick who was out in Vegas and told everybody he secretly worked for the Genovese crime family. He wants to debate that. I can prove that he said that. Telling people he knew Joey the Clown Lombardo, who he's never met in his life. I know his grandson. You never met him. You're full of shit. So, stop it already. Stop living in some fucking fantasy land. Go by your real fucking name, Lieber, which isn't fucking Scarpo. That's a moniker you came up with to make yourself sound like a fucking tough guy. Sounds like you read too many books on Greg the Grim Reaper Scarpa, who's a fucking rat. So, it's like, be who you are. Everybody knows what my real last name is. That's no secret. I don't hide that from nobody. It's just the reality of it. So, listen, I'm not one to pot call the kettle black, but I'm not a bitch. I'm not a punk. I'll say what I mean. Whatever I say here, I'll say to your face. I think a lot of people know this by now. I'm not going to back down. And just for this guy to just keep lying, he's a jerk off and a disgrace. He's trying to pretend to be something he never can be. Undercover for the Genoveses. Get the fuck out of here. Who you try? What, you write articles, Ed? Ed, you write articles for the Genovese crime family? Undercover? Who the fuck needs to undercover write? It's the stupidest fucking thing I've ever heard. He tried to make himself a fucking big shot in Las Vegas. I run Cosa Nostra News and blah, 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 and I'm secretly a mobster. You're a dumb, fat, loser piece of shit. That's all you are. And you're a big mouth. So keep running your mouth. Keep doing what you're doing. But definitely don't sit here and say you invited me for coffee to sit down like gentlemen, because there will be no gentlemanly discussion. I can guarantee you that. Just like I can also guarantee you that the shit that you have said about a lot of people on the streets, you run into them, you're going to have problems. They don't like you, Ed. So maybe you ought to be more worried about them than me running my mouth on a radio show. I'm just being honest with you. Because you're reckless. And when you get reckless, shit happens. And that's not a threat on my end. I'm just telling you reality of the situation, the people you're talking about. So all that being said, we're going to move on to some questions. All right, question number 1. This jerk off. Gets me so angry. Anyway, why doesn't the mob enforce the rules on rats these days? As it must be easy enough to find them, as they all do talk shows and write books, etc., etc., etc. Maybe if the mob just killed them, this wouldn't be an issue. Well, it's a different time period. This is the 1960s, 1940s, 1930s, 1920s anymore, not even 1980s and 1970s. It's a different world with cameras in every corner, technology being what it is. First of all, you can't just kill a federal informant. It doesn't work that easily. You see what happened when they tried to kill Sammy Gravano. They all went to prison for the rest of their lives. It's just not something that can be done anymore. The mob doesn't have that sort of power that they had. And when I say that, I don't mean toughness. I mean politically. When you own political power, you control voting, you control government. That's truly when you're a powerhouse. You control unions, you control the docks. That's when you rule everything. That's when you can get away with it because nobody will talk. Today, everybody talks. With the invention of the fucking cell phone, how many times have you seen a fucking murder take place on Facebook Live or a fucking murder take place and somebody's filming a body flopping on the fucking cement? We have just become a technological society, and I just don't... It just becomes not worth it. It brings too much heat. You kill a federal informant, believe me, you're going to have more heat up your ass than a volcano. And so that's probably why it doesn't happen. I'm not saying that it hasn't been attempted, hasn't been discussed, but the reality is that we just, guys become too much public awareness or whatever. People know who they are. It's just not that easy to do it anymore. All right. Who killed, made the most money, and was the biggest organization, Pablo Escobar or Toto Rina? Toto Rina, listen, had a lot of money, killed a lot of fucking people, also killed government officials. Escobar was the same deal, but on a bigger scale. Escobar didn't need to be in Europe. He could maintain everything that he needed to do in Medellin, Colombia. He killed politicians as well. But I think more money, Escobar hands down. Bigger organization. Toto Reno had that's where it's going to get. I think Toto Reno probably had a bigger organization, but you're talking about an organization that had a different functionality. Escobar was coke, drugs, etc., murder. Toto Reno, a little bit of drugs, or a lot of drugs in his case, murder, but it's sort of two different fucking vehicles. But I still think Escobar probably of the two was bigger. Maybe they were both insanely feared, but Escobar was just absolutely fucking ruthless, as was Rena as well. But I think for the sake of this argument, I think Escobar probably realistically was of the two probably the bigger. All right, in your opinion, was Tommy Agro a significant, impactful member of the Gambinos, or was he just your typical mobster? Well, Tip was a fucking maniac. And 75 becomes a made guy, and the Gambinos, Joe Engello is the one who sponsored him to be made. Agro was well known for his temper and violence. He pretty much almost beat Joe Dogs Iannuzzi to death with a fucking baseball bat. He ran lucrative bookmaking and gambling in Florida, was very tight with Paul Castellano, which is probably a lot of the reason why people respected him at the time. He always carried around scissors for his weapons. He was your typical mobster, and I think the only reason why he gets amplified is because of those tapes that are out on YouTube, where Joe Dogs Iannuzzi sort of wiretapped him himself. And if you listen to them, they can be found on YouTube. If you go to type in Joe Dogs Iannuzzi, Tommy Agro, and you'll hear Tommy Agro going fucking crazy, threatening to kill him and doing all kinds of stuff. He was no different than your typical gangsters. The difference was sort of that he gets more, I think, airplay because of those tapes. So he wasn't anything like particularly special, but he was a nasty individual. All right. Who was the strongest or most powerful between Philadelphia mob and the Chicago outfit? I don't know if you're talking about today's time period. I mean, obviously you can't be talking about the 1960s because I don't think many people can touch Chicago with the way they control government. Today's time period, Chicago is still Chicago. They have lost a lot of the political connections that they did have, but they still have, a lot of rackets, a lot of guys. In no way, shape, or form are they weak. No way, shape, or form are they nothing to worry about. But I think because they're probably bigger, because they probably have a lot more rackets involved, Chicago, I think, at this point is more powerful, but that's just my 2 cents. Philadelphia has definitely come back from the Scarfo bullshit drama, and they're pretty much, as far as I'm concerned, run pretty effectively. We'll see what happens with this New Jersey indictments. That could unravel all of it potentially. I think you're going to see some, come September, I think you're going to see some really fucked up shit go down as far as like indictments and stuff like that. And I think that's going to be what ultimately is going to determine what happens to Philadelphia in the end. But I think for my sake, Chicago definitely stronger. And I want to say hello to my Chicago friend, Joey Lombardo, who's out there. He's probably going to be listening in a cigar place. So, hey, Joey, how are you? Hopefully things are good. Thanks for reaching out as much as you do. It's good to have friends in Chicago, definitely. All right. Who was the most dangerous underboss, Michael Franzese or Neil Delacroix? All right. You got to be kidding me with this question, right? Michael Franzese, a tough guy. Nah, not dangerous. I don't even think the guy's dangerous. What's he do? Cough on you? Michael Franzese was a business guy. Listen, I've talked about him enough. I don't want to get into like a rabbit trail of what a jerk-off lying piece of shit he is. Billionaire, my ass. Neil Delacroix was the most dangerous fuck. One of the most dangerous fucks I've ever seen in my life. He didn't fuck around. He grew up in a tough era, did not hesitate. You could probably slap Michael Franzese in the middle of the street and he probably wouldn't do shit. But Neil Delacroix would have you killed immediately if he didn't do it himself. So any idea that Michael Franzese was dangerous is bullshit. They called him the Yuppie Don, which he wasn't a boss. He was a captain, which I guess you could say loosely is a boss, but he tries to inflate that into like he was, fucking Don Corleone. But Neil Delacroix, hands down, not even a comparison there. Just two totally different guys to begin with. But Michael Franzese was not tough on any level, as far as I'm concerned. Has there ever been anyone made that wasn't full Italian? Sure. They seem to change the rules like every dozen years or so. Originally, you had to be 100%. Now you don't have to be. Now your father has to be. Then they go back to you have to be 100%. There's been guys that have been made that are half. John Vesey's the one that vexes the shit out of me. I don't understand how that fucking guy got made. If you don't know anything about John Vesey, he's a rat pile of shit, scumbag who ratted everybody out. From Philly, South Philly, you can look all that up. I don't want to get into that rabbit trail bullshit, but he did a number on John Stanfa for sure, and he tried to put away a lot of guys, and it didn't work. And it is what it is. But you can look that up for yourself. I don't want to get into that guy. He's very active on social media. Let me tell you, from what I understand. I don't know. I don't have no contacts with the guy. Just because I think he's a fucking scumbag, and I'm sure that he'll find a way to find me, because that seems to be the way that this goes. All right. What's the best story you've heard that best represents La Cosa Nostra and its values? If true, the best I believe is Sonny Black going to the meeting after Donnie Brasco was revealed as an FBI agent. Yeah, I would agree with that. I also think Roy DeMeo, prior to going to his final meeting, he instructed his son on a lot of different things. If you haven't read that book, the name of the book is For the Sins of My Father by Albert DeMeo. It's a really good book. It's about father and son kind of deal, and Albert talks a lot about how in the end his father sort of knew it was coming, but still chose to go. Left his jewelry, left his wallet, left everything that was meaningful to him with his son. So I think the fact that he knew he was likely going to be killed and went anyway, that's old school. That's the way it goes. So I think that probably those two things, the Sonny Black thing and Roy DeMeo, probably represents La Cosa Nostra in terms of being a gangster till the end, not giving in, I think you could even say John Gotti fits that mold, goes to prison, doesn't utter a word, doesn't allow special treatment, fights until the end. That's Cosa Nostra. That's old school. Okay. In your opinion, what mob hit had the single biggest impact and influence on the course of organized crime that took place in the United States? Now, I can go back and forth on the dichotomy of this question. Are we talking about a hit that influenced the mob, a mob family, or for the better and for the negative? If I had to really think of one thing that stands out to me that probably was huge, was the hit on Angelo Bruno for multiple reasons. One, Philadelphia has never been the same. Two, it allowed that little fucking pipsqueak, Nicky Scarfo, to do what he did. And when I say that, I'm not trying to say Nicky Scarfo wasn't a tough guy, that he was a murderer, didn't fuck around. But Nicky Scarfo damaged Philadelphia. He killed everybody. He went after the Riccobanis for no fucking reason other than ego and money. Whereas Angelo Bruno sort of let the Riccobanis do what they wanted to do. And I think that once Nicky Scarfo sort of took the helm, which was a plant by Chin Genovese, I don't care what anybody says, that was sort of devised. Nicky fucking destroyed Philadelphia, but if Angelo Bruno doesn't die and they succeed on a regular path, or the succession is a regular path, I don't think you're going to have some of the problems that you have, because once Angelo Bruno left, Chicken Man Testa jumps in, boom, a fucking explosion, he gets fucking killed, Nicky Scarfo just sneaks his ass right in there. And yeah, we could talk about exactly how that had happened. I'd rather not do that, go into that. We've talked about that before. But I think ultimately that's what shaped what we see now in Philadelphia. And I'm not saying that in a negative way. I'm just saying that when you have somebody that's running an organized crime thing, and yeah, Bruno had a lot of negative sort of beliefs and a lot of things that he did ultimately led to people killing him, especially the drug issue. Wouldn't let his own guys deal drugs, but he let the Gambino cousins run drugs out of Cherry Hill. That's a big issue. And then you got the Atlantic City thing and everything that was going to be happening there. I probably offhand, I think that Bruno, the murder was probably justified on some certain kind of street level. I think it was definitely, unlike Vinny the Chin would ever say it was not sanctioned and this was not a sanctioned hit. It really wasn't. But I think that Chin, once again, doing what he has done and what he did prior and post Bruno hit, sort of nod his head going, yeah, go ahead. But on the record, I'm going to say no. And, Chin was very treacherous in that sort of way. But I think the Bruno hit really changed the makeup of Philadelphia. And they sort of, because if you look post Nicky Scarfo, or even with Nicky Scarfo, it sort of becomes the Wild Wild West in Philadelphia. It isn't so much the Wild Wild West now, but there are some dividing lines in Philadelphia. Let's just put it that way. There is some narratives from multiple sides that could create problems at some point. That's just being honest. I've talked about that at length before. But I think definitely the hit on Angelo Bruno was the one that really impacted a crime family, and especially Philadelphia. All right, after Appalachian, was there ever anything similar again, with so many families represented at one meeting, or did it revert only to a handful of the most senior bosses meeting once a year, twice a year, and the commission and how it operates today? I don't really know specifically how the commission operates today. I would assume that a couple of guys get together once in a while, they discuss what's going on, but I don't think that the prestige that it once had is still there. Totally different. It's a different time period, so I think that today everybody just kind of doesn't really want to be seen together. It's bad news if you get seen together. There were a couple of years there was something that took place at a big luxurious hotel where a bunch of them got caught meeting and it started a bunch of shit. So I think that, do they still meet? Sure. Do they meet like they did? No, absolutely not. I don't think it would be a smart decision. You're going to have certain bosses that get along with other bosses. But I think that the consensus that it's five families versus the world, so to speak, as it was like in the 40s, 50s, 60s, is sort of different now. I think a lot of guys are just trying to lay low, stay out of the limelight, and just run their family. They're not going to worry about this guy, and this guy. If there's a beef, it's handled a certain way. But I think that the mystique and the sort of pageantry of what that isn't really the same anymore. All right. Nino Gaggi's relationship with John Gotti after Big Paul got whacked. Really, there was no relationship there afterwards. Nino Gaggi was on trial along with Paul Castellano for a lot of other stuff. And then ultimately he goes to prison like right after. So really there wasn't any sort of static there. And what was Nino Gaggi going to say at that point? Because he's going to prison. He ends up dying in prison a couple of years later. So it doesn't really matter what his relationship or what his opinion would have been on John Gotti. Had Nino Gaggi not gone to prison, would Nino Gaggi have gone after Gotti? Probably not. He would have fallen in line like everybody else, and et cetera, et cetera. Is there a rule about mustaches being allowed? If so, why does Greg Scarpa and why did Phil Testa have one? Listen, who's going to tell Greg Scarpa what the fuck he can do? Nobody. Greg Scarpa was the Grim Reaper. He's a rat. Yes, but he was a tough guy in the streets. Who's going to tell him no? Nobody. Phil Testa having a mustache, that's Philadelphia. Philadelphia is a little different. Philadelphia is not a part of the five families. So, whatever the rule isn't, I'm not really sure. I never heard anything to the contrary, to be honest with you about it. But as far as I know, I don't think anybody really gives a shit these days. Maybe back in the 40s it was different. Guys wanted to look like businessmen. Anything short of that, I couldn't really tell you. Okay. Who was more powerful between Tony Accardo and Carlo Gambino when both organizations were at their peak? Tony Accardo was a fucking tough guy. He's one of my favorites for a lot of different reasons. He could be shrewd, he could be a businessman, and he could also be a fucking maniac and a killer when he needed to be. He was a terrific fucking boss. Carlo Gambino was the same kind of thing. I don't think he was as psychotic as Tony Accardo was, but he was a button pusher too. But if you look at both of the organizations at their peak, Tony Accardo had the fucking unions, he had the polls, he had the government, the city councils, whereas Carlo Gambino's real power hold was on like the garment district and the fucking unions, cement unions, carpenters unions. And Gambino had one thing that Tony Accardo didn't. Just like Accardo had one thing that Gambino didn't. Accardo had gambling. Big time Vegas shit. Whereas Gambino had the whole entire eastern seaboard. He owned every port. What he said happened. So you're looking at two different guys from different, sort of the same shell characters, but they're different in the sense that Tony Accardo was seen a little bit more than Gambino. Gambino just kind of stayed in the shadows a lot more than Tony Accardo did. But I think that if you're looking at power, and when we talk about power, it's pushing a button, having something done. I think both of them, in their own respects, could have pushed a button and had anybody killed they wanted to, for whatever reason they wanted to. But I think because at the time Tony Accardo owned politicians out the ass, I think Tony Accardo was probably more powerful than Gambino at that time. Only because of the unions, the Teamsters, the pension funds, and all of that. New York did have the ability to dip into those pension funds, but not like Chicago did. Chicago owned, forget about it. Gambino, power everywhere as well, but I just think that Tony Accardo probably had more power in terms of what he was able to accomplish in a very short period of time, just politically. But if you're looking for the guy that is the powerhouse moneymaker, the powerhouse button pusher, the powerhouse racketeer, I think Carlo Gambino is probably the bigger of the two in that sense. Okay. Lucky Luciano versus Costello versus Vitone. I don't know who Vitone is. Maybe that was a spelling error. So we'll just go Lucky Luciano versus Costello versus the Chin. Who is the greatest and most powerful of those three? Well, look. Luciano was powerful, but I don't think he had really the kind of power that we saw post-Luciano. Costello had political power, and that's the reason why Costello was beloved in the mob. They didn't call him the dictator for nothing. He was able to just get himself into government and politics and control and get favors done. That's why Costello was so strong. It wasn't because Costello was willing to pick up a gun. Vincent the Chin was a little different in terms of how he went about things, but I think of those three, the strongest probably was Luciano for the time period he grew up in, then the Chin, then Costello. However, there's three other names, Accardo, Gambino, and Russell Buffalino. I think Buffalino, Gambino, and Accardo were three of the most powerful mob bosses that ever lived, along with Carlos Marcello. He was insanely powerful, as was Santos Trafficante. So I think of the three, because the question being asked is Luciano versus Costello versus the Chin, who of those three was the greatest and most powerful? Luciano invented the modern-day mafia as we see. Costello was sort of the Tom Hagen character from The Godfather, was able to just politically move things around. Vinny the Chin just was able to stay the fuck off the radar. But I think probably of the three, probably Luciano was stronger for the time period that Luciano was in. But moving past the 60s, not many people can touch the Chin, like I said, other than Buffalino and Gambino and etc. So there you go. All right, who is the more stronger and more powerful ruthless boss? Sam Giancana or Albert Anastasia? Sam Giancana was pretty ruthless, but I don't think he could come close to Albert Anastasia. Murder Inc. That's all I got to say, Murder Inc. Anastasia didn't fuck around. He was not somebody to be trifled with. Giancana was a tough guy, and Giancana killed a lot of people, but Anastasia was on a whole fucking other playing field than Giancana was. Giancana, a lot of the power that he got was devised from the celebrity bullshit, from Vegas and stuff like that. Giancana was not... History will look back on Giancana multiple ways. But Giancana was more of a bully. Giancana was a temporary solution to almost a permanent problem. And as you see, Giancana gets whacked out in his own house, cooking sausages and peppers or whatever the fuck he was cooking in his basement. He gets killed by his own people because Giancana couldn't keep his fucking mouth shut. Giancana wanted to be a celebrity. And that's a time period in Chicago where Chicago started to go south. Because prior to Giancana, most Chicago guys stayed relatively under the radar. Everybody knew who they were, but they weren't brazen. Giancana was like totally brazen, wouldn't stop hanging out at the Cal Neva, wouldn't stop banging Marilyn Monroe, the McGuire sisters. The JFK thing really fucked him over and put him in a bad spot, but that was by his own choice. And he would ultimately blame Frank Sinatra for all of that, which is bullshit. But the reality is that Giancana was who he was for the time he was, but Anastasia by far was a hell of a lot more dangerous than Giancana. Okay, biggest blunder of a boss not acting quick enough. An example would be Bonanno not acting on Carlo Gambino himself instead of being secretive. Big Paul not acting on having the tapes and not killing Gotti and Ruggiero. Or Bruno not acting on changing times and the increase of dissatisfaction within his family and the drug policies. And which one of these three should have known better? Well, Big Paul, first of all, if he wanted to kill Gotti and Ruggiero, he could have done it. He didn't do it. But I don't think that was so much of a big issue, considering that Paul Castellano was already indicted on the commission trial. He was fucked for a lot of different reasons. Gotti was the least of his problems. The drug trafficking shit that Angelo Ruggiero allegedly was involved in was really peanuts compared to the Dominic Montiglio, Nino Gaggi, the car scheme, Anthony Center, the DeMeo crew. That was what was going to get Paul Castellano 100 fucking years in prison. It had nothing to do with really, Angelo Ruggiero selling a little heroin. So we could take that one off the board. Angelo Bruno not sort of changing with the times. That's a big issue because ultimately it's what led to him getting killed. Should he have known better? No, because I believed he believed in old school. He was the boss. What he said went. Maybe he was a little too naive in thinking that somebody wouldn't hurt him. And then you have the Bonanno not acting on Gambino himself. And the point that the person who asked this is making is because Gambino ultimately knew Joe Bonanno was a scumbag. It was Joe Colombo was the one who went to Gambino and the other bosses and said Bonanno was trying to hit all of you. And that ultimately gets Bonanno shelved. But I don't think that really compares to what happened with Angelo Bruno. And I say that because Bruno had an opportunity to get with the changing times. He sort of put a chokehold on his own family, and ultimately he gets whacked for it. And that's just the reality. Okay, I know who asked this question. Joy Faraci, my favorite. Joy wants to know if there's any word on where Sammy the Bull Gravano has been. The reason why Joy is asking this is because her brother, Alan Kaiser, was killed at 17 years old by Sammy Gravano. Still something nobody wants to fucking talk about. He was an innocent kid walking home on his birthday, minding his own fucking business like most young kids are. Sammy Gravano and Louis Melito were in a car. They see him. They think he's somebody else that was involved in something that Sammy wanted retribution for. They pull over, they coax him to the car, they shotgun him in the face, in the head, whatever else, and they kill a 17-year-old kid. This is something that Sammy Gravano never paid for because Sammy Gravano admitted to 19 murders. I don't know if Alan was a part of that murder. I would almost assume that he wasn't, but he killed an innocent kid, and just based on that, the government should have never, ever in a million fucking years ever given him or cut him a break on that. Sammy Gravano rats on John Gotti. Philip Leonetti rats on John Gotti. Gotti gets fucking life in prison without parole, and Sammy Gravano gets out only to turn around and start selling drugs with neo-Nazis and gets his whole family involved in drug dealing, gets caught up and does another fucking 20 years in Arizona, gets out, and he's selling autographs on eBay and whatever else. I know who's doing that for him, and they're a scumbag. And I'm not going to get into who's doing that, but he knows me, I know him, and I know he's the one doing it. It's a scumbag move because basically you're getting around Son of Sam laws, and that's ridiculous. Sammy Gravano should have to pay the Kaiser family. Money never solves it. Money never changes what he did. But you know what? There should have been a fucking penalty for what he did to Alan Kaiser. Joy has to live with this every day of her life. She has to see that bald-headed, skinny, ugly, wet rat parade himself as if he's fucking somebody. Same thing goes for his daughter Karen, who has repeatedly used who her father is to make her a tough guy, to legitimize herself. Now, she's gone on to do some great things for herself as far as money making or whatever, but she still falls short in the moral category. Because you can sit there and talk about, my father only killed mob guys. Bullshit. He killed a 17-year-old kid for nothing. For no fucking reason, mistaken identity. That is something that should have gotten him killed. Because the mob doesn't buy that. They don't deal with that. You don't touch civilians. You don't hurt normal people. But for some reason, Paul Castellano lacked the fucking balls. And anybody around the situation didn't react to it or do anything. I don't know why. But, I wasn't there. But what he has been up to is selling his autographs and getting plastic surgery. From what I understand, he's gotten an extensive amount of plastic surgery done so that he doesn't look like a wrinkled rat, but he's always going to look like a wrinkled rat. He's like ancient, apparently still fucking bossing people around, still making threats to people like he's a tough guy. I could tell a couple stories about that, but I'm not going to. But who gives a fuck where Sammy Gravano is? Who cares? Let him just fucking rot and die and just put his body somewhere in a fucking unmarked grave and let the rats piss on him. I don't give a fuck about the guy. He's a bottom-feeding, garbage-pail fuck. So, Joy, I hope that answers your question. All right. Do you believe in the 1970s that the other bosses of the New York families knew that Lombardo was actually the boss of the Genoveses and insulated himself with the likes of Tommy Boy and Funzy? Absolutely. Totally agree. Think you stole the words out of my mouth. Yeah, I know. I think everybody always knows who really the boss is. Guys know who the front boss is. Guys knows who the street boss is. Guys know who the real boss is, but they just sort of bypass that. So the reality is that, especially if you look at some of the testimony going back to the 70s and 80s when everybody claimed not to know who the boss was, you hear wiretaps where they all know. So the idea that somebody doesn't know, it's kind of bullshit. All right. How the hell did the Genoveses keep their name after all the screw-ups that Vito created over his criminal career, especially near the end of his life? To me, I don't understand. If you look at the genesis of crime family names, I mean, technically the Genoveses should have been the Luciano crime family. I don't know why they would. I think in that specific instance, Luciano wouldn't have kept his name because Genovese tried to trash him and chase him out of the mob, which he sort of kind of did in the end. And of course, his ego was so big he wants it named after himself. So I totally get that. Why it wasn't changed past that, I know Joey Massino tried to change the name of his family from Bonanno to Massino. John Gotti tried to help him do that, but the commission wasn't going to have that. I don't really understand what the terms are for that. Obviously, I'm not privy to that sort of information. I don't think that anybody from that walk of life is going to invite me to a meeting like that. But I think it's interesting. I think it just depends on how much power a guy has and how well he's respected is whether or not it's allowed to happen or not. If you really want to go back to the original names, you can look that up for yourself. But believe me, they weren't what they are now. I think the Genovese crime family, first of all, I don't really have a beef with the name, but go back and call it the Luciano crime family because that's exactly who they were. But Vito Genovese didn't like Luciano, didn't like a lot of people, and that's just the reality of it. Ego. All right. Why do you think Vito Rizzuto took a downgrade to be captain of the Bonanno crime family when he was the boss of his own family? How is that a downgrade? He's involved in 2 crime families. Captain in the Bonannos? Okay, so he has some power and say in the Bonanno crime family, but he's also the boss of his own family. And that's something that really is kind of rare. You don't see that a whole lot. At one point, Russell Buffalino oversaw the Genoveses while he was the boss of his own family. So he sort of was the boss of 2 families, but more of a babysitter type of thing. But I don't think it's a downgrade. Look, Vito Rizzuto would have been in a better situation just running Canada and staying the hell away from the Bonannos because ultimately getting involved with them led to him going and doing serious prison time. So I don't think it benefited him being with the Bonannos. And then after that hit and everything that happened, Rizzuto had a huge beef with Joey Massino. He saw something in Massino he didn't like, and he stayed the fuck away from him after that. And it's a good thing he kind of did because look what happens. Massino ends up turning rat. So he saved himself even more misery, but I don't think it was really a downgrade. It allowed him to get money and kickbacks from the Bonannos as well as run his own crime family. I think the question, it's a good question, but I think that ultimately at the end of the day, I think the reality is did he really need to get involved with them? Maybe he feel like he needed to be relevant in the American Mafia as well. I'm not really sure. I don't know Vito Rizzuto, never knew him, God rest his soul, but seems to me like having a position in one family and being the boss of another is sort of counterproductive. But, who knows? All right, Jimmy Blues Allo, what can you tell me about him? Basically, he really is responsible for like a lot of the casino stuff. He was really, really close with Meyer Lanksy, and him and Lanksy opened up a, oh boy, I just totally lost my train of thought here. Jimmy Allo, he met, oh Lord have mercy, where am I at? Okay. Let me back up. 1904 to 2001, he was a high-ranking captain in the Genovese crime family. With Meyer Lansky's help, they set up casino operations in Florida and in Cuba. In 26, he becomes a main man of Joe Massaria's New York gang. He was named capo then of the old Joe Adonis crew, and he oversaw clubs, speakeasies, and big-time illegal gambling in Brooklyn in 1929. Lucky Luciano introduces Allo to Meyer Lanksy. This will be an important moment for Allo because Allo was really good at business, really solid. He was great at doing a lot of things. He wasn't exactly a high-end murderer. But Luciano really wanted Allo near Lanksy for a couple of reasons. Really, the most important reason is he knew the money that could be made. Mob historians have said that Luciano Lucky wanted to probably keep a closer eye on Lanksy. I don't really believe that to be the case. They were very tight. Lanksy made a lot of money for Luciano, so I don't really necessarily believe that. His first job came in helping set up a casino in Hallandale Beach, Florida, and Lanksy sort of sees the abilities in Allo. He can not only think like Lanksy, but he can operate like Lanksy. And they would go on to sort of form a partnership. But Lanksy, when they were down in Florida, also realized that in order to get permits, in order to get the cops to lay off, they would sort of have to pay politicians, city officials, and cops just to get everybody out of the way. And that's exactly what he and Allo did. They paid off everybody. And because they were able to do that, they didn't have any government or public opposition whatsoever. And they would continue that until about 1947. Then they would open up a second casino. But the town sort of became gentrified, changed a little bit to Republican. The economy sort of diversified. And they were forced to sell and make plans for Cuba. And ultimately, he would go on to be Lansky's right-hand man and the model for Johnny Ola and the Godfather Part 2. So that's a little bit about Jimmy Blue Eyes Allo. You can look up some stuff about him if you want. I don't want to do a whole entire dissertation on him. But if you've ever seen The Godfather 2, you know Johnny Ola was the archetype that he was, and that was pretty much Jimmy Blue Eyes. Okay. Entire mob history, who is the best earner, Gambino or Tommy Lucchese? Gambino. Lucchese was a smart guy. Obviously, him and Gambino were related through the children, got married. It was, in fact, Lucchese who gets a piece of Idlewild Airport, which would become JFK, as a gift from Carlo Gambino. That actually sort of helps out both sides, but I think the better earner of the two is Gambino. More men, more strength. On their own devices, however, probably on their own, Tommy Lucchese made more. Just by himself on his own devices with no men, I think he would have been the better earner, but I think combined with what they had, obviously Carlo Gambino. Okay. You have to pick 10 mob guys to start your own crime family. Who are the 10 that you would take? You can only take a couple from the old world, a couple from the 80s and 90s, but you have to take one or two from today's time period. Who would you take? All right, so I sort of cheated here because there's so many fucking names. The first guy I take is Ray Patriarca, hands down. I take Vincent the Chin Gigante. I take Tony Salerno, Joey Lombardo, Carlo Gambino, Frank Costello, Albert Anastasia, Tony Accardo, Joey Merlino, Tommy Lucchese, and John Gotti. Those are the guys that I take. The reason why I take them, Ray Patriarca, enough said. Vinny the Chin, pretty much can stay off the radar. Tony Salerno, incredible businessman. Joey Lombardo, I don't need to say anything about him. Carlo Gambino, very shrewd, very calculating. John Gotti, for obvious reasons. Tommy Lucchese, very brilliant. Frank Costello owns the politicians. Albert Anastasia, because he'll get business done if I need somebody murdered. Tony Accardo, just the name itself. Joey Merlino, definitely. I'm trying to think if there's that's probably over 10. I'm trying to think if there's one guy I would take that's sort of like a I'm trying to think if I wanted to take another guy that would be sort of not tongue in cheek, but just a guy that I would take because he's incredibly smart and a guy that can get along with George Borghese. How about that? I would take George Borghese any day of the week, just based on what I know about him and just because I like him. He's a good guy. So, all right. So, all that being said, those are all the questions that we have. We've gone over an hour, which was not my plan, but I like to ramble off the fucking mouth a bit. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we are going to talk about Frank Sinatra and his Mafia affiliation. Stay tuned to Mob Talk Radio. And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. We are going to be talking about Frank Sinatra and his mob ties. There has been long this assertion that Frank Sinatra was in deep with the mob, and he was. I mean, that's reality. Sinatra had over, I think it's like something close to 2,800 pages or 2,800 files on him. The government followed him his whole entire life because of his associations with people. Guys like Ed Scarpo report garbage like Frank Sinatra was once asked to be inducted into the mob. That is absolutely unequivocally not true. That never happened in a million years. There's a lot of reasons why that wouldn't happen, but I think for the sake of intelligence and brain cells here, we're not even going to have to explain that one. So let's get right into it. This is a fairly big one. I'm going to try to include as much as I can, but there is a lot of background stuff that has to go into this as well. So let's get right started on it now. In Sinatra's early days, it was Willie Moretti who helped Sinatra out. And in return, he would get kickbacks and really was the one who ended up stopping the garbage between Tommy Dorsey. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, there's a scene in The Godfather where Al Martino is playing Johnny Fontane. He needs a favor. He wants to get into a movie. Waltz, who is the production guy in Hollywood, doesn't want Johnny Fontane involved in any of it, so Fontane goes to Don Corleone, who puts Tom Hagen in control of it, and ultimately he's given the role. There's also a scene where Michael is talking to Kay, saying that Luca Brasi put a gun in his mouth and said either your brains or your signature are going to be on this paper. Now, what is true about that is that Frank Sinatra started with Tommy Dorsey. Tommy Dorsey brought him in, and as Sinatra's sort of fame began to rise, Dorsey realizes Frank Sinatra's going to make them a lot of money. Sinatra, on the other hand, kind of realizes that he needs to make more money. He's not getting what he considers to be a fair end. And ultimately, somebody sticks a gun in his mouth and Sinatra is let out of his contract. So that part of the movie is actually historically accurate in a lot of different ways. But there's a lot of other stuff to kind of get to. We need to talk about Willie Moretti a little bit in case you don't know who he is. He was from Cliffside Park, New Jersey. From 1933 through 51, Moretti held close associations with Joe Adonis, Satino Accardi, and Abner's Willman, and they ran pretty much every single gambling den in New Jersey and New York at the time. Moretti's operations were based out of Hasbrook Heights and Deal, New Jersey. Sinatra's other connection was a familiar one, as Anthony Moretti was Frank Sinatra's godfather. Sinatra first, through his wife, Nancy Barbato, his first wife, who just recently passed away, God rest her soul, she was cousins with John Barbato, who was a Moretti associate. So you can see that Sinatra, from very early on, has a connection through his wife and also through his father. When Sinatra was first starting out, Moretti would use his power to help Sinatra get into some clubs. Sinatra was very well unknown at the time and needed to be able to get in some of the bigger high-dollar clubs, and it was through Moretti that he was able to do that. In 1939, Sinatra signs with Tommy Dorsey. By 1941, Sinatra, like I said earlier, was insanely popular and had become name-recognized, nationally recognized, and really wanted a better financial deal. Tommy Dorsey absolutely refused because he knew he was going to lose money. So Sinatra goes to Willie Moretti, who in turn went to Dorsey, put a gun inside of his mouth, and said, "You're going to sign this or we're going to kill you." And Dorsey, absolutely terrified, let Sinatra out of his contract for $1. Tommy Dorsey and Frank Sinatra in later years would make some great albums together, and Dorsey would never really comment on what happened between them, but they remained close friends. It was just more of a business thing. Sinatra was present at the Havana Conference in 1946. To what extent is sort of circumspect in these days? He was sort of a front for entertainment. The conference was between the American Cosa Nostra and the Italian Cosa Nostra. The meeting was arranged by Lucky Luciano. The meeting was regarding mob policies, rules, business interests, and narcotics. It was held December 26th of 1946 at the Hotel Nazionale. And here's some background. At the beginning of World War II, Lucky Luciano was serving 30 to 50 years for pandering. And then in 1942, United States military intelligence officers approached Joe Sox Lanza and Meyer Lanksy with a proposal for Lucky Luciano. At the time, Lanza was one of the bosses who controlled the Manhattan Fulton Fish Market, all its workers, and he also controlled the docks. Lanksy had a far-reaching power along the Atlantic seaboard, and it just made sense for the military to discuss things with them because the military was worried about the Nazis sabotaging the docks and other shipping facilities in New York, and they needed them open, and they were worried about East Coast ports. The government informed Lucky Luciano in prison that if his mob family could protect the entire East Coast ports, he would be paroled at the end of the war and deported back to Italy rather than serve the rest of his life in prison. Luciano definitely agreed to it. The war ended, and Luciano was sent packing back to Italy February of 1946. In 1946, he received a package that basically was a date and a name. It was December Hotel Nazionale, and included in the box was a passport. And as Luciano hit the docks in Cuba, Meyer Lanksy greeted him. Lanksy told Luciano plans were set, and he even asked Luciano to invest $150,000 into interest into the Hotel Nazionale. It was a big hotel. They were going to make a lot of money, and Luciano had no problem doing that. Remember, this is the time when the mob thought that they could own Cuba. This is while they had the pockets of Batista before Castro did what he ultimately would end up doing. On Sinatra's end, he was there to sort of play cover for the entertainment, and he actually arrived in Cuba with Al Capone's cousins, Charlie, Rocco, and Joe Fischetti. So he had very close ties to the Fischetti brothers as well. The conference's main objective was narcotics. They also discussed Bugsy Seigel and some of the problems that they were having there. That was actually the meeting where it was decided Benny Siegel would be killed. Just because of the oversight that was going on in Vegas. They would also discuss Havana casino interests. And the other topic was the issue between Vito Genovese and Lucky Luciano. Luciano kind of knew that Genovese would be getting out of prison and there would be problems, but we're going to get a little bit more into that in a second. They also wanted to discuss changes. No more boss of bosses. They wanted to discuss narcotics and the flow from Italy to the United States. They installed a commission, but the undertone was really about Vito Genovese and the problem that was going to be coming with him. Genovese didn't like his rank after he went to prison, and he felt like he was owed for keeping his mouth quiet and going to prison and not saying a word. He wanted Luciano to step down, and it made issues worse. And what it actually does is begins to splinter the Luciano crime family. On one side, you had Frank Costello, and the other side you have with Genovese. Luciano thought that he could pretty much control things from behind the scenes. He felt like even though he was no longer allowed in the United States, that he could possibly try to run things. Ultimately, that's not the way it would go down, but he really totally underestimated just the shrewd capability that Vito Genovese had. Genovese also had the support from other families and bosses, so Luciano was really in a tough spot. By the middle of the meeting, Luciano changed his mind about the boss of bosses rule and named himself boss of bosses to try and quell Genovese. He thought at first, you know what, we're going to go ahead and get rid of the boss of bosses because we don't want one person being over top of us all. But then he changes his mind and says, you know what, I'm going to be the boss of boss, because he thought that if he did that, he could control the other bosses and he could control the vote if Genovese tried to overthrow him, and he would be completely wrong about that. Luciano was always a narcotics guy, but the minute he gets kicked out of the United States, he wants to import heroin because he can control it from the other side of the pond, so to speak. He would ship it from North Africa into Italy, then to Cuba, then to the United States through Canada, and he actually lays the foundation for a drug network, which ultimately years later would lead to the Pizza Connection. Sinatra met Sam Giancana through two people. The first person he met Giancana from was Skinny D'Amato, who owned the 500 Club in New Jersey, Atlantic City, New Jersey, and he also met him through the Fischetti Brothers. But we need to sort of talk about Skinny D'Amato for a second and give you a little background on who he was. Skinny D'Amato was from New Jersey. He owned the 500 Club, where Sinatra really got his early hooks into the entertainment business. Skinny was born in Atlantic City in 1908. He was one of 8 kids. His parents died very young. And at 15, Skinny would open up a cigar store, which was very profitable. And he ended up being able to take care of his 7 other siblings. He then opened up a dining and gambling den, or a dining hall, called Luigi's, and that was profitable. And then he would open up the 500 Club, which was ultimately a front for gambling. He would then begin a partnership with the Atlantic County Treasurer Enoch Nucky Johnson and his political organization. Skinny also had close friendships with Chicago and Sam Giancana, as well Carlos Marcello and others. And Skinny bought the 500 Club, actually, believe it or not, from the Philadelphia boss Marco Reginelli. The 500 Club, like I said earlier, was a front for illegal gambling, and it was used to draw. What he did was he would use Jerry Lewis, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Frank Sinatra, any big names that he could use to draw in people to gamble. And it was really Sinatra that brought in the biggest crowds. As well, Martin and Lewis obviously were huge crowds. That's where they got their start. Now, Jerry Lewis tells a very bullshit story that he was doing a show all by himself, and the club promoters weren't really interested in what Jerry was doing. And he says, I got a great guy. We do great stuff together. And when he gets here, we'll do it, and it'll be great. And that guy was Dean Martin. There is a little truth to the story in the sense that nothing that they did was planned. They just kind of just went with it, and it worked. But the idea that Jerry Lewis was somewhat of a headliner in those days was an absolute joke. Jerry Lewis really didn't get any fame until Dean Martin came along. And one of the big misnomers is that Dean Martin didn't like Jerry Lewis. He was a lot older than Jerry, had sort of a different aspect to his career. Dean Martin was actually the funny guy of the two, but Jerry constantly wanted him to play the straight man. And it led to a lot of resentment in future years because Dean would go on record as saying, I got to play with the monkey every day. I'm getting tired of this. And what it was Dean wanted to do films. Dean wanted to sing. And yet he was caught in this business trap with Jerry Lewis. And ultimately they would go their own ways and they wouldn't speak together for 25 years up until Dean Paul Martin, Dean's son, died in a plane crash while working for the National Guard. And then I believe in 1975 on one of Jerry's telethons, him and Frank Sinatra put them together for one last time. But Dean ultimately didn't like Jerry. He felt like he didn't get any respect. He felt like Jerry was a screen hog and a ham and just wasn't willing to share the limelight. Now, we can go back and forth on that all day, but I think Jerry Lewis wrote a book, a love letter to Dean Martin or something like that, and the book was absolutely ridiculous. I've never had a whole lot of respect for Jerry Lewis, but his place in comedy definitely is always going to be there. But I think for the sake of what we're talking about, it was just Dean just couldn't tolerate the drama from Jerry. And so going back to the Skinny D'Amato Club, that's where Frank meets a lot of heavyweights like Giancana and other guys, the Fischetti Brothers. And ultimately, Skinny D'Amato would end up going on to manage the Cal Neva. Now, the Cal Neva was a lodge that Sinatra bought, and I'm going to get into more details there. It was really designed for a place for celebrities to go who didn't want to go all the way into Las Vegas and wanted to get out of California and still wanted to kind of be close to California. So it was right in between on the line. It was designed sort of like the Flamingo in Vegas. There would be gambling and entertainment and etc. Giancana ultimately, along with Dean Martin and Sinatra, would pretty much own the Cal Neva Lodge. All right, so we have to talk about, and let's see, let me go to the Cal Neva really quick, because this is probably important. Okay, the Cal Neva was bought in 1960 through Frank Sinatra's shell company, the Park Lake Entertainment. He split ownership 13% to Skinny D'Amato, 13% to Hank Sanacola, and he retained 25%. Dean Martin would have 11%. And so 62% of ownership belonged to those guys, and Giancana had 38% silent ownership. By 1962, Sinatra owned 50% of the property, Sanacola owned 33%, and Martin sold out due to Giancana's involvement. Dean Martin didn't like Sam Giancana, did not want to be around him for any reason, so he would ultimately sell out. Eventually, Sanacola would try to sell out because he didn't like Giancana. and that caused a lot of problems. Sinatra then opens the club year-round, which prior to that it was only open during the summer months, and he used the Prohibition-era smuggling tunnels beneath the properties to allow mob guys to kind of move around the property without seeing by the public. The FBI pretty much had already been investigating the lodge because Joe Kennedy was a constant guest. It's also alleged that Joe Kennedy was there when the paperwork was signed by Sinatra to take over ownership of the property, and that Joe Kennedy effectively was the middleman for the sale of the property, acting as the silent partner standing in for Sam Giancana. The expansion of the lodge and the upgrades that the lodge needed, all that money came from Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters Union, once again with Joe Kennedy being the middleman for that. Giancana ultimately would be blacklisted from the property because he was blacklisted from Vegas, but Sinatra still allowed him to stay at the lodge constantly. Sinatra ultimately would get caught allowing Giancana to be at his lodge, and as a result, Nevada would rip away Sinatra's gaming license. Now, you can go onto YouTube and type in gaming hearings or gaming license hearings, Frank Sinatra, and hear what he has to say about it. He denies knowing anybody, which is the way Frank would always be. Frank would finally sell the property to the Caesars Palace Corporation for $2 million in 1967. And then back in January of 2018, that property was actually sold for $40 million. So, Giancana became sort of a problem. But we also kind of go back, we got to go back and sort of talk about Giancana and the Kennedys, because there's sort of a tie-in here. And this is basically what it is. When Kennedy was running, when Kennedy was considering, I'm looking at my notes here, sorry. Okay, when Kennedy effectively decided that he was going to try and run for president. Now, Joe Kennedy wanted to run, but he had gotten into some trouble, and there was no way that the government was going to allow that. So Joe Kennedy kind of props his son up, and he knew that his son would have a hard time winning the election in southern states because the Kennedys were Catholic. Joe also felt that if he could nail down Chicago and West Virginia, that Kennedy could probably win the election. Now, if you go back to that time period, the election was very, very close. Kennedy barely won. So what Joe Kennedy realizes is he needs some celebrity status, and he also needs the mob's help. Now, one thing about Joe Kennedy, he's a bootlegger, a narcotics trafficker, a fraudster. The Kennedys got a lot of their money from bootlegging and narcotics and gun trafficking. That's well known. And Joe Kennedy was friendly with a lot of mob guys, but he needed a front guy. And what he does is he calls Sinatra's people up and asks Frank to come out to the Kennedy compound. And he basically says to Frank, look, we need your help to get Jack elected. And if we can do that, then I will make sure that my sons leave the mob alone. So for Sinatra, it facilitates a couple of things. One, he's getting close to the Kennedys, which is great for Sinatra. He also can endear himself to his mob buddies, which is another thing he always liked, because one of the things that Frank always said is if he hadn't have been a singer, he'd have been a gangster. So there you go. So Sinatra goes to Johnny Roselli, and then they go to Sam Giancana, and they basically explain kind of the deal. Giancana and the rest of the mob were absolutely fine with the idea of it. They'd essentially own a president, and they could perhaps get rid of Castro and go back towards Cuba. So the mob goes to work. They lobbied hard. They controlled voter districts and even double-tapped votes, which means if I go in and I vote for Kennedy, instead of hitting it once, they hit it twice. More dead people voted in that election than ever before. And everybody got what they wanted. Now, that's not to say, I'm not literally saying that Kennedy cheated and won, but I'm saying there was a lot of stuff that was done to ensure Kennedy would win. You call it what you want. Sinatra and Kennedy would actually become really close friends. Frank would get hookers for Kennedy. Kennedy would hang out with him. It was through Sinatra that Kennedy would, nail all these high-end hookers. He would bang the McGuire sisters, Judith Exner, Marilyn Monroe, and we sort of know what road that travels down because we've talked about that before. But the problem is that once Kennedy wins the election, he names his brother Bobby as Attorney General, and that's going to create a big problem. Bobby sees this in a couple of ways. First of all, Bobby was screwing Marilyn Monroe as well. They sort of the brother tag team deal. Marilyn Monroe was a problem because she couldn't keep her mouth shut. She was making threats to them that she would expose the Kennedy family and all their mob affiliations. They couldn't have that. And what the Kennedys really essentially did was they blamed Frank Sinatra for it. They went to Sinatra, begged him for help. He pulled the lever to get them to meet with the mob. The mob took care of business. And then as a result, Bobby Kennedy tries to explain to his brother John that you got to get rid of Sinatra. You got to stay away from these people. It's going to create problems. John didn't particularly care for what Bobby was saying, but he went along with it. And at that point, the Mafia was going to be in for a rude awakening. Sinatra constantly would be seen with Kennedy during this time period, and Bobby just kind of knew that Sinatra was a big risk along with the mob ties and everything else that was going on. And Bobby really forgets who put him in charge and his brother into office, and he launches into this organized crime crusade. It infuriated the mob, and Sinatra embraced Giancana because, the idea that Bobby was going after the mob infuriated them. The illegal deportation of Carlos Marcello started a bunch of shit. The shit with Hoffa started a bunch of shit. And it just infuriated the mob to the point where they wanted Kennedy gone. And Sinatra further enraged Sam Giancana because Sinatra kept hanging out with the Kennedys. And one of the other unique, interesting issues with this was that Sinatra was a lifelong Democrat. His mother, Dolly, was a lifelong Democrat. She was an abortionist, and she performed abortions, believe it or not. But she was very political. She was a political power in New Jersey. And Sinatra was a lifelong Democrat. And the minute that Kennedy pulled his shit, not only did he never speak to the Kennedys again, but he never fucking voted Democrat ever again. And part of that was that John Kennedy was supposed to stay at Sinatra's compound out in Palm Springs, and Sinatra paid millions of dollars to have his home upgraded so that Kennedy could stay there. And Kennedy decided to go to Bing Crosby's house on the advice of Bobby Kennedy. And Bing Crosby was a lifelong Republican and beat his kids on a regular basis. And Sinatra just absolutely fucking went berserk. And like I said, he never again voted Democrat after that. Sinatra also had close ties with Carlo Gambino, Bugsy Seigel, Sam Giancana, Lucky Luciano, and the Fischettis. Like I said, after Kennedy's death, he never voted Democrat again. If you're familiar with Jackie Mason, he had an interesting issue with Jackie Mason. If you don't know who Jackie Mason is, look him up. And I don't say this in a derogatory way, but Jackie Mason, traditionally very Jewish comedian, famous in a lot of circles. But his whole shtick at one point was doing a routine making fun of Frank Sinatra. The next thing that Jackie Mason knows is that he was being beaten in his hotel room by gangsters who shot up the room. Mason was warned that if he ever made fun of Frank Sinatra again, he would be killed. And so Sinatra carried some serious weight. Guys would do favors for him that they wouldn't do with anybody else. It was Sinatra who gave Lucky Luciano the last payoff he would ever get from rackets that he still controlled in the United States. His FBI file is over 3,800 pages, and the FBI followed him for over 40 years. Mario Puzo, who wrote The Godfather, the Johnny Fontaine character, which we talked about earlier, was actually based on Frank Sinatra. And when Sinatra found out, he ends up finding Mario Puzo in a park and basically walks up to him and threatens to beat the shit out of him. Shut his fucking mouth. And it wasn't because he wrote about a character that was based on Frank. Frank was furious because in the screenplay, the Fontaine character cries to Don Corleone because he can't get a job. And that's one thing that Sinatra was really irate about. So once again, you see that Sinatra's not going to put up with it. Kitty Kelly wrote a infamous expose on Sinatra, and he ended up seeing the book and reading portions of it, and she gets a mysterious call to shut up or she'd be killed. Next thing you know, she never mentioned Sinatra ever again, and the book actually left the shelves very quickly. But going back to Sinatra's childhood, his father, Marty, the link between his father, Marty, and the mob, Marty would bootleg booze, and he would ride as protection a few times with some mob guys. Now, also, Sinatra had a racetrack, which he co-owned with Dean Martin, Ray Patriarca, in Rhode Island. He also was the front man for Ray Patriarca in Vegas, bought shares under his name, but gave the dividends to Patriarca. So one of the things that, and there's some other guys that Sinatra was a part of, but I don't want to get into a whole, he knew this guy and that, and the third. It basically comes down to this. Sinatra used the mob to help his career. Ultimately, when he helped Chicago with the Kennedys, that backfired on him. Sam Giancana was caught on wiretaps threatening to kill Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra. He wanted to kill Sinatra. He blamed Sinatra for the whole entire Kennedy thing, which one might say that Frank probably shouldn't have gotten involved in that. I think that that's fair to say, but I think ultimately at the end of the day, it was Giancana's activities of not staying away from the Cal Neva, not continuing to do the Joey Gallo thing and hang out with celebrities, that sort of did Giancana in as well. And Giancana knew too much about too many things, sort of like Johnny Roselli. He knew too much about the Kennedys, knew too much about the Castro assassination deal. And ultimately, Giancana, I believe, is killed for that reason. But as far as Sinatra's mob ties, he grew up in a time period in an area where the mob was prevalent. He used them to his advantage. Like he always said on record, these guys gave me work when nobody would. And so he felt indebted to them, and he would even go out of his way to do things for them. Some may argue to extremes, and then would deny it at Senate hearings. He doesn't know this guy, he doesn't know that guy, he's never heard of this guy or that guy. So Sinatra was old school. Now, there were some rumors out there that Sinatra at one point had offered the FBI to become an informant to do something for his country. I don't believe any of that. I think that's a lie. There's just no way he would have done that. He knew too many people, knew too many things, and I think that just any idea that like Sinatra would have been inducted to the Jersey Mob is a joke. I don't know where some of these hack journalists get these ideas, but it was more of a business thing. Sinatra was the face of Italian music. Sinatra really was an Italian hero. He still is to this day. Whether you like his music or not, it's still played on a lot of different radio stations. And he truly represented the kid from Hoboken that made good. While I could do a whole entire Sinatra biography on his life and just some of the quirks that he had, I think for the sake of length and time, we just keep it to the mob stuff. He had a lot of contacts, knew a lot of people. He used them to his advantage. There was a story about a guy named Lee Mortimer who was a gossip columnist. One of the things that people don't understand is Frank Sinatra at one point owned a part of a gossip columnist, and that was sort of the idea, him and the Chicago mob. And the idea is if they owned part of this gossip columnist magazine bullshit, then they can kind of control the narrative that comes out about himself and other people. But it really didn't work because they had City Confidential, Hush Hush magazine, and all these other things back in the day. But Lee Mortimer was a gossip columnist. And apparently one night Sinatra's getting pretty toasty at a bar, and Lee Mortimer walks in, and he had written some snide comment about Sinatra and his affiliations and Ava Gardner and et cetera. And Sinatra apparently would get into some sort of altercation, and Frank had caps on his front teeth, and there was a punch thrown, and Sinatra got his caps knocked out, and Lee Mortimer was threatened to be killed by the mob. And years later, Lee Mortimer would die, and Sinatra literally once a year would get in his car, get belted, drive all the way out to his grave and piss on it. That's how much he hated Lee Mortimer. That's how much he hated gossip columnists. Frank used the mob to his advantage in any way that possibly that he could. And that was just him. That was his life. I think that there's a lot of comedians that came up during the day that Alan King knew mob guys. Fucking Sammy Davis Jr. That was another thing, is that the mob didn't want Sammy Davis Jr. marrying a white woman. My Brit. They just did not want it. They thought it was wrong, and Sammy was threatened repeatedly over it to end the marriage. And Frank Sinatra, going against the mob, stood up for him, said absolutely not. He can marry whoever the fuck he wants. And that created friction. So Sinatra not only used the mob to his advantage, but he also, when he believed in something, he would stand up right for it. He wouldn't just back down, and that was one of the problems. And his real issue really came with the mob. The only issue that he really ever had, because he did a lot of front business for them, especially Ray Patriarca. Him and Ray were very tight. And I think that the one thing that really infuriated the mob was that Sinatra just did everything he could for them, but then there were times that he couldn't, and they would get infuriated, feeling like he owed them. The shit that happened in Westchester, where he met the heads of the 5 families, that was, he claimed not to know who any of them were, but he did it out of respect for them, because a lot of them gave him business and etc. So to sort of take it into a narrative and make it like Frank Sinatra is some evil guy who murdered people and did all this crazy shit, it's just not true. He grew up in a time period where all the clubs, the Copacabana, the 500 Club in Atlantic City, Vegas, they're all mob, the Pump Room in Chicago, all owned by the mob. And so in order to get your career going, much like, you go back into the 60s when a lot of the record producers didn't pay any royalties to African-American singers. In order to get airplay, it was about paying off the guy at the station. If you pay the guy off at the station, he's going to play your record. So much like the 60s and 70s, probably like really the 60s is really where it was at. Sinatra did the same thing. He used their power to get him to a certain point. And I think especially with Giancana, Giancana just felt like he should do, that Sinatra should just do whatever the fuck he wanted. He blamed Sinatra for the Kennedy issue when really it wasn't Sinatra's fault. He did everybody a favor, made introductions, whatever deal was made the deal was made with them. But I think, and this is getting on the verge of conspiracy theory, but I think the one thing that probably made things very uneasy is when John F. Kennedy got killed. Because I think that if we're going to, let's say, step in the shoes of someone who believes that the mob had everything to do with that, which I still believe to this day, that would have made Sinatra very nervous. That would have put Sinatra in a very bad position, because he's the one that arranged the dialogue. He's the one that set the wheels sort of in motion for people to connect. That in and of itself would have created probably a lot of nervousness on Sinatra's behalf. Probably would have drawn the ire of the Mafia just because they were looking for a scapegoat. But the truth is that the Kennedys just made a play, and the Kennedys got away with it for as long as they did. And you see the eventuality of it. Bobby Kennedy's killed. John F. Kennedy is killed. I don't think there's anything that Joe Kennedy could have done to have stopped it. But I think that if you're ever going to believe in a conspiracy theory, this is the one you should believe. I think ultimately the mob had everything to do with that. We're going to talk the rest of our lives about JFK. I think that Donald Trump had a great opportunity to sort of release JFK files, which he refused to do. I think there's a reason for that. But you can choose to believe what you want about that. But if you look at how Kennedy got elected, you look at their roots, you look at who they were attached to, why they were attached to them, everything that happened in between, I just kind of have a hard time buying that it's one lone nut named Lee Harvey Oswald who just decided one day he was going to kill Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald worked for the CIA. It's well noted. He was in Russia for a long time. He had CIA training. This is not just some podunk fucking redneck that decided to grab a fucking gun and go crazy. If you believe that, then I got a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you. We're never going to know what the true extent of what happened. It's probably best for the American public not to know, but I think the reality is, given all the factors and given all the facts, so that's probably exactly what happened. Was the mob set it up and took care of it. And just really quickly, Jack Ruby, who killed Oswald, was a gangster. He ran clubs for Carlos Marcello. in Texas. He was a pimp, a narcotics trafficker. This was a guy who was a gangster. So I don't think it's any like happenstance or like any sort of like karma or just it's just not an instance of a guy named Jack Ruby walking in and killing Oswald. First of all, everybody in the police station knew who the fuck Jack Ruby was. Jack Ruby was a very, very well-known guy. He had actually gone to the police station prior to that day, and everyone had seen him walking around. He was getting the way out of the joint. Next day he walks in, pops him, not a problem. And Jack Ruby ended up in prison telling prison wardens and guards that he was scared for his fucking life. Why is a guy like that scared for his life? He's got no reason to be. So when you take the Jack Ruby situation, you take the fact that Oswald met with Johnny Roselli, that's sort of a fucking issue. Oswald meets Ruby through Johnny Roselli. So when you put those things kind of at the forefront of what we're talking about, that's sort of the point I'm trying to make. It's up to you. If you want to believe otherwise, it's absolutely fine. But remember, this is the same United States government that denied for fucking 40 years that we tried to kill Fidel Castro until those files came out. And the fact that they tried to use the Mafia to do it. So if the government lied for 30 years about that, 40 years for that, then I don't think it's too hard of a narrative to try to believe that maybe there was some underhanded shit going on as far as John F. Kennedy goes. But that was pretty much Sinatra's life with gangsters. There's a couple other stories I could tell, but I think for the sake of time, and it just leave it as it is. Sinatra had a lot of friends, and it was a time period where you utilized power and friendships to get ahead. And, I think Sinatra probably had an infatuation with gangsters. He hung out with a lot of them, knew a lot of powerful people, but once again, he also knew a lot of guys that got killed. So I think one of the quick stories I heard is one of Sinatra's favorite things was to be sitting in a restaurant with gangsters, or to be sitting in a restaurant with contemporary, and he would argue about what's the greatest mob hit of all time. How do you shoot him? How do you kill him? Sinatra was just engrossed with the whole thing. So maybe he was infatuated and a little overboard with it, and ultimately he would end up paying for it because, like I said, his gaming license got ripped. Senate committee people would go after him. So he really learned his lesson, and it was pretty much right before Ronald Reagan wins the presidency, that he sort of knocks that shit off. And I think he got the message loud and clear that the days of the mob and him having any sort of partnership were over. Vegas was pretty much done. And that was that. And that was the sort of the genesis of the Sinatra legend and the Sinatra war. I mean, there's been other sort of rumors that Sinatra had people killed, but that's really not the reality of it. There was a situation with Judy Garland. I think she was married to Sid Luft at the time. I don't think it was Minnelli. I think it was Sid Luft. And he used to beat Judy Garland senseless all the time. Just an absolute fucking creep. And she called Frank Sinatra from New York City, and he was out in L.A., and she explained she was being beaten up, and she needed help. And within 5 minutes, there were like 400 cops at her hotel trying to get her out of the hotel room. It took literally Frank Sinatra one fucking phone call to get that handled. Also, there was the legend of Mia Farrow when she found out that her creep show husband, Woody, was touching the children. She called Frank Sinatra, and Frank Sinatra put her in contact with somebody who drove by and picked her up in the car and said, "What's the problem?" She explained, and she said, "We'll have him killed." The person in the car said, "Well, we'll have him killed. Don't you worry about it." And she said, no, that's not what she wanted. And the person in the car said, listen, if you change your mind, let us know. But nobody's going to touch your kids ever again. So Frank Sinatra had a lot of power in that respect. Guys loved him enough to do him a favor, but that favor was always called upon. Whether it was a benefit, whether it was free entertainment, Sinatra always paid them back as much as he could. But like I said, after Ronald Reagan, that was pretty much over for Frank. He just kind of stayed out of it. And if you watch, he sort of makes the right idea and the right decision, because the minute that he sort of walks away from all that, it's sort of the decline of the mob in the heyday. So he made the right decision and kind of steering clear of it. But I mean, history is history, and everybody will always look back on Sinatra for having shady friends, and that's just the reality of it. Like I said earlier, not many comedians, singers in those days didn't have friends like that. And that's just the reality of it. So, all that being said, that's going to be it for today. You can reach me at Real Mob Talk 7 on Twitter. You can go on to Mob Talk Radio on Facebook. Just type it in the search bar. Find us there. Like us, subscribe, share. YouTube, Mob Talk Radio channel is there. Also, the theme song that was done by my friend Lord Willen, also known as Chris. I believe he has a link where you can get a free download to the theme song. If I do not include that link in this, I will provide it later on in the day. I think it's somewhere on my phone. I got to check it out. All that being said, send your threats, your whininess, your complaints, your death threats, your criticisms. You know where to send those. You guys always do. Next week, we'll be back with an all-new show. I am making plans currently to begin the construction of a brand new webpage, which will be password protected. It will be membership sort of format, so we're going to try to get rid of some of the scumbags. But all that being said, I don't think I'm going to launch that until probably October. But I just want to make sure that everything sort of goes. Now, for those who are wondering if the blog is going to continue on Blogger, it will not. It will all be on the new page, but like I said, I can pop in code and it'll just automatically transfer you to the new page. You're going to have articles. You're going to have stuff from the True Crime page by Scott Williams Collier, radio shows, live events, giveaways, and et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of good stuff coming your way, along with some documentary type of stuff we're going to be working on. So a lot of things are going to change. Just be patient while we try to work out all the kinks. Once again, you can always submit your questions to me on Twitter, personal message, or on Facebook, personal message. I will try to answer them as quick as I can, but you guys have no idea the amount of volume that I do get as far as that goes. So that's that. Next week we'll be back with an all-new guest. We'll be back with an all-new topic, more questions, and we're going to move in a little bit of a new direction. And what I mean by that is we're still going to cover the mob, but I'm also going to cover some other criminal aspects. I have to branch out a little bit. And I think once the new page takes off, the format's pretty much going to be probably twice a week Mafia, once a week. We're going to cover like other crime syndicates like the Yakuza, the Camorra, which is still Mafia, but biker gangs, the Dixie Mafia. There's going to be a lot of different groups we're going to cover. I think because once I move to a new page, I just want to it has to be all inclusive and it has to be a little bigger than it is now, and that's the way we're going to go. But we're always going to cover the mob here. We're always going to talk about the mob, but there's also going to be some other stuff so that people that like the crime genre can get a bit of everything. But I think the mob is always going to be sort of the foundation of the things that I do. And all that being said, I think that's what we got going on. Once again, thank you for listening. Thank you for continuing to share the show. Thank you for continuing to participate. And like I said, I apologize for the ranting about other people. But I have a low tolerance for lies. I have a low tolerance for nonsense. But as we start to move to the new page, I think that's going to be less and less because a lot of these people aren't going to have access to that. And so a lot of the bullshit will pretty much go away, I think, for the most part. So thanks for listening. Hope everybody enjoyed the show. Just do me a solid. I don't ask you guys to ever do anything for me. Just share it. Just share it to one person. That's it. That's all I ask. All that being said, have a great weekend, guys, and we'll see you next week.